Hi, I'm Ted Haftegabber, founder and producer of Live Talks Los Angeles. Thanks for joining us. Since we started over a decade ago, we have brought you hundreds of conversations with storytellers, writers, actors, musicians, humorists, chefs, and thought leaders in business and science. You can watch and hear most of these in our YouTube channel and our podcast. For details, visit livetalksla.org. And now, here's the show you've tuned in to see.
Thank you. Hi, Simon.
Hi, Arthur. Arthur's one of my favorite people in the world. When he said you want to come and do this, the answer was immediately yes, because basically any chance that we get to talk is fun. So I want to start off talking about some of the stuff that you've been working on. You're an expert in happiness. You've written a book about happiness. And we were just talking backstage about what happiness is and what happiness isn't.
Right.
And you said something that I found really, really interesting that I want you to explore further, which is that we also raised the point of misery.
Right.
And that happiness and misery, to us, are opposites, but apparently they're not opposites.
They're not.
And I find that very interesting.
Now, to begin with, everybody who studies happiness, and there's not that big a community out there, those specialists in human happiness, they're all looking for it for a reason. I mean, they're studying it for a reason. It's me-search for anybody who studies human happiness. And that's the first thing to keep in mind. And that means that probably a lack of happiness is an issue in their lives. Saying this for a friend. Or unhappiness is a little bit too high. But let me start by actually saying one quick thing, just one little aside about happiness and the thing that's making me really, really happy right now, besides being here with my friend Simon. I'm seeing out there, I have these friends, Cecilia and Richard Schultz, who are coming from Orange County. They have this daughter who's just a wonderful, beautiful girl named Jessica. And their daughter, 3 months from now, is going to be my daughter-in-law. And I am truly happy about that. So anyway, I wanted to bring that up because it really is salient. It's really top of mind. But back to misery. One of the most interesting things in the science of happiness, and what I talk about with my students at Harvard, is that everybody experiences unhappiness, and some of them experience a whole lot of unhappiness. And so they take a class in happiness, thinking that since they have so much unhappiness, what they need is more happiness. And I start by disabusing them of that notion. It turns out that happiness and unhappiness are not opposites. They're actually processed in different hemispheres of the prefrontal cortex. And almost all of the things that we do to raise happiness they're related to, but they're not the same thing as lowering your unhappiness. You need different strategies for that. One of the biggest mistakes that people make in their lives is thinking they're going to get happier by lowering the sources of unhappiness in their life. And a classic case of this is people say, I'd be a lot happier if I didn't have such a long commute. No, and that's wrong, because a commute gives you unhappiness, not a lack of happiness. Now, you get my point. The same thing is true with money, by the way. Your grandmother told you that money doesn't buy happiness, and she's absolutely right. But what money does is it lowers the sources of unhappiness, which is especially true when you don't have any money. And the biggest mistake that we make with money as human beings, and I try to explain this to my MBA students all the time, they absorb it only to a certain extent, is that when you don't have any money and you get a little bit more, you find that you're on balance, feeling better. And so what's happening is that your unhappiness is falling, not that your happiness is rising, but you misinterpret that. And then once you hit the threshold, you want to keep feeling better, but the unhappiness part is satiated, and you never get any happiness. And that's why you chase it for the rest of your life. I remember this when I made my living as you heard in the introduction, a classical musician for a long time, for 12 years, from when I was 19 until I was 31 full-time. And I didn't have any health insurance, and I didn't go to the dentist for 6 years at one point, and I needed to go to the dentist. I'm still paying the price. Every time I go, they're like, did you go a long time without going to the dentist? And, of course, I never went without cigarettes during that time. So it's all, apparently, it's priorities. But when I finally went to the dentist after 6 years, I was feeling so much better. And I thought to myself, money bought happiness, but it didn't. It lowered unhappiness.
Which is such an interesting thought, because we live in a world right now where the pursuit of happiness has become a business.
Yeah.
It's an industry.
Right.
And I don't remember the exact numbers, but the concept of the sort of self-help industry, which didn't exist prior to the 1970s, has grown exponentially over the past few decades, which, if you think about it, if it were working, the industry should be in decline.
Right. Exactly right.
And I think there's this,
Why do you think this is, though?
I think it's like dieting, which is, there's recidivism, which is, it actually doesn't solve the problem, to your point, and you're talking at a biological level, it doesn't solve the problem,
right.
But it worked for a little bit. So I think diets are really interesting, right? Because you try a diet, you pay money for a diet, it works for a little bit, it fails, but you blame yourself and not the diet. But it's the diet that failed. And I think there's a similarity here, which is there's this industry that says we will make you happy.
Right.
You try it, it doesn't work, you blame yourself, and then you try the next one. And I find that funny, because if it were any other product, you would blame the product.
Right.
And we don't. And I think that makes for an insidious industry.
But do you think that the happiness industry, and we're in it. I'm in it academically, but I write about it, and you write books, and we're talking about helping people live. Is this an exercise? Are we charlatans?
No, I get very defensive when somebody accuses me of being in the self-help industry, and I have worked hard not to be in the self-help industry, because I think. It's not that I'm against the industry and that there's not good content in there, but as I said before, I think too much of that industry preys on the weak and insecure, offering snake oil. Now, I'm okay with the fact that some of my work has made it into that world, but I never went into this to do that. And it goes back, and it goes right to your original point of your students, of why they take the happiness course. I mean, I remember when I was a college student, I took some basic psychology courses, and I asked sort of a whole bunch of my peers, why are you taking this course, or why do you want to be a psychology major? I was trying to decide what major I wanted to be. And almost to a T, I would, as best as I can remember, 100% said, I want to understand other people so I can better understand myself.
Right.
And the reality is, you'll understand other people if you can understand yourself first. Study yourself. And so, yeah, yeah. That's just me.
Well, it's an interesting point, isn't it? Because you wonder if this is an exercise in futility for yourself and for other people. And I see this industry, I see the whole study of the science of happiness as fundamentally changing over the past 30 years.
Well, we're studying it for the first. I mean,
it's an actual legitimate area of study.
I mean, you know this about the entire sort of discipline of psychology. We study broken things. If you're broken, we'll study that.
Right.
But Marty Seligman and all those folks who started saying, well, instead of trying to study what's broken and not do that, why don't we study what works and repeat that?
Right.
And what I think is interesting, just waxing philosophical, which is, I think narrative is a big part of it. And as I've been learning about, studying even my own work, I've completely rejected the concept of good, bad, right, wrong, and I see everything as balance. And a huge part about it is narrative. I'll give you an example of that. There's no such thing as good, bad, or right or wrong, right? So I am chronically disorganized. My assistant has job security forever, right? I'm terrible. And I've always said that this is a weakness. That my biggest weakness is I'm chronically disorganized. And I remember back in the early days of my career, I was trying to make a living, and went to this networking event, and a guy met me. He goes, "You're really good at what you do. I want to hire you. Here's my card. Get in touch. Let's do this." Right. Right. Which is about as good as it gets. And I somehow lost his business card as soon as he gave it to me. And if I was organized, I'd be texting him from the taxi, or I'd at least email him the next day. Right. Not me. I'd lost the business card. And so about 2 weeks later, I found his business card at the bottom of a briefcase, probably covered in dust bunnies. And I emailed him and said, hey, I don't know if you remember, we met a couple of weeks ago at this event, just reaching out. And he wanted to work with me more because he thought I was busy. Okay? So is it bad to be disorganized? And the answer is it depends.
Yeah.
It's context.
Yeah.
And so I think that goes for absolutely everything in our lives. We're constantly labeling ourselves, as this or that, and unhappy, happy, all of these things. And the answer is it depends. It's all context. And everything that good that happens in our lives comes at a cost, and everything bad comes with opportunity or lesson. And I don't think we weigh both sides. And so I think the mistake that we make is we choose to be less unhappy or we choose to be more happy. And this goes to your original point, which is they coexist.
Right.
It's not one or, it's one and.
Well, let's talk about why for a second, why one would actually choose unhappiness. And you might say it's because, millennials are nihilists or something like that. I mean, you're the expert on millennials. I mean, you have this unbelievably viral talk about millennials. I learned a lot about millennials from you and having adult children. And it's a real walk in the park, let me tell you, because it's different than those. I'm on the cusp of the Gen X and baby boomers. You're a Gen Xer.
I'm Gen X, yeah.
But here's the real question. It's easy to say, well, a lot of young people, they just want to be unhappy. They want to be victims and they want to complain all the time. But here's an interesting thing. I remember when I grew up in Seattle, and
well, that explains the unhappiness.
Yeah, tell me about it. It's just and I remember I was a little kid when Woodstock happened. So I wasn't involved in it. I mean, certainly I wasn't. I'm not of the hippie generation at all. But I remember there was a hippie on TV from Woodstock, and he said, "If it feels good, do it." And my dad said, "That's the end of America," right? And the truth of the matter is that it's incredibly bad advice. If it feels good, do it. That's incredibly bad advice because as a blanket piece of advice, it's not contextually appropriate.
Right.
There are lots and lots of cases when you shouldn't do something that feels good because, let me tell you, Mother Nature does not care if you're happy. You can do lots of stuff that feels good and it won't make you happy. But here's the problem. I think that we've changed the polarity in our society such that a lot of young people, they don't say if it feels good, do it. They say if it feels bad, make it stop. That's what a lot of our society is based on today. And some of it perhaps has to do with the safetyism from parents my generation, or maybe it has to do with the fear polarity in our culture, which we can talk about. There's lots of possible explanations for it. You can chalk it all up to social media. I don't know. But if you basically, when you see in my university where half of the students are being treated psychiatrically for mood disorders, we have to come to the conclusion that there is an overarching ideology of things that make me feel unhappy, things that are making me experience suffering. They have to stop. Now, here's the problem with that. One of the things that we know, or that many of us who study happiness will define happiness in terms of three sort of macronutrients. I mean, food is protein, carbohydrates, and fat. Happiness has three macronutrients to it. And this is all based on a big literature that shows that the happiest people have these things in abundance and balance, which are enjoyment, satisfaction, and purpose. There's big literatures behind enjoyment and satisfaction and purpose. And they're all trouble, and they're all complicated, and they're all interesting. But the most paradoxical of them all is purpose, is meaning and purpose. Why? Because it requires unhappiness. For you to be happy, you need meaning. For you to have meaning, you need to suffer. That's a problem, isn't it, if you're trying to get rid of suffering in your life? And understanding this made me question a lot of what I was doing. How much of my energy was going into alleviating my unhappiness, avoiding my suffering, staying away from the things that might actually make me experience pain? It made me really reassess these things. Does this resonate with you?
Yeah, I mean, I've got so many ideas bubbling as you're talking about it. I've said before, when we do something we love, it's called passion, and when we do something we don't love, it's called stress. But they both require hard work. Mm-hmm. The most passionate people work late hours, they don't get enough sleep, they screw up their relationships, but it all feels worth it.
Right.
Whereas when you're doing something, this goes to the purpose thing, when you're doing something that you're working late hours, you're screwing up your relationships, and you're not sleeping, but there's no purpose behind it, it doesn't feel worth it. And so it's not that working with purpose is easy. It's that working with purpose feels worth it, and I think people have, and I think this. If you want to talk about the young generation, which is the entire concept of purpose is misunderstood. Purpose has to be pretty specific. I want to make an impact in the world is not being purpose-driven. It's so generic, it's useless.
Right.
That's like saying I want to be happy. Like, how do you define happiness?
Right.
We were joking in the back. I said the marshmallow experiment. You give kid one marshmallow and say if you wait, you can have this marshmallow an hour. If you wait 2 minutes, you can have 3 minutes. And there's wonderful things on YouTube, and you watch these kids stressing out and sniffing the marshmallow.
80% fail.
Yeah,
they eat the marshmallow.
I am a one marshmallow guy.
Yeah.
Right. But as we were talking about backstage, which is, well, how do you define the marshmallow?
Yeah.
And again, it goes right back to context.
Yeah.
And I think we're talking about a much bigger issue, which is our world has become so much more binary. Right, wrong, good, bad, left, right. Everything's become black and white. And the reality is our world, how we actually exist in it, our relationships, our relationship with work, even our relationship with ourselves, what happiness means, it's all pretty gray. And yet we want everything to be crystal clear, and we want switches. We want to turn it off, and we want to turn it on.
Right.
And what I can't help but think, and I'm curious because you're with your students, which is, context and narrative matter so much that when all they're doing is trying to prevent their unhappiness, what they're actually doing is talking only about unhappiness.
Right.
Which then perpetuates unhappiness.
Yes.
And we are very suggestive animals, even to ourselves.
Yeah.
Like, we can talk ourselves into pretty much any feeling we want. And I wonder if it's not the pursuit of happiness that's failing, I wonder, but rather the obsession with the unhappiness that's reminding us constantly of how unhappy we are, so that any strategy, even if they're all the right strategies from, the self-help course that I took in the book that I read, they're actually good. It's actually good advice that is destined to fail.
So this is really interesting, and there's a little bit of research on this. And I got this from, we have a guest here, Scott Barry Kaufman, who's a really distinct. He's got the most popular psychology podcast in the world, and he worked with Martin Seligman at Penn, and he teaches at Barnard College in New York. And so I got a lot of this. I'm cribbing this from he's a real licensed psychologist. I'm just an economist, so I say that with appropriate humility. And one of the interesting things that you find in the literature is that the more you wish you were happy, the unhappier you get. But the more you work to be happier, you've got a fighting chance. Now, what's the difference between this? If you came to me and you said, Simon says, I want to know calculus. I'd be like, Simon, don't wish for it. Get a book. Get a book. Study it. This is a really interesting thing. So why? Why is this? Because when it comes to happiness, if you just wish you were happier, you'll notice that you're not. And you'll be focusing, exactly as you say, on your unhappiness. But if you do the work, you can actually make progress.
So does the work work?
Yeah. So this is the interesting thing. So there's a brand new paper about this from neuroscientists and social psychologists at University of Wisconsin that are looking at interventions where people are actually induced to do the work, a.k.a. studying the science of happiness and applying the studies to their life with actual real-life exercises to change their own behavior, and they get significantly happier.
Can I throw a spanner in the works here?
Uh-huh.
We are social animals.
Uh-huh.
And our happiness is predicated on serving others.
Right.
And you have a son who's a Marine, and you and I both know folks who wear uniform, and their work is hard.
Right.
There's tremendous sacrifice. They all go in knowing they're not going to get rich. Somebody told me when he joined the military it was his get-rich-slow plan. And 100% of the work they do is for others. And the overwhelming level of satisfaction with the sacrifice is much higher than the people I meet in private sector. So I'll tell you a little accidental experiment I did, because I'd love to get your input. So a friend of mine, she was really struggling in life. Like, her marriage was kind of on the rocks. Her kids were driving her crazy. Her career wasn't doing well, and just like she couldn't get a break.
Right.
And she was in a bad place, and I've known her for years. She knows what I do. So she called me up and said, "Will you help?" I said, "Of course. Why don't you come to my house every week for an hour and a half, and we're just going to sit down and talk?" And that's what we did. And every week for 90 minutes, I didn't watch the clock. She wasn't paying by the hour. It's like, "Oh, sorry, time's up." I would say that's the difference between a therapist and a friend. It's like a friend never goes, "Time's up."
Yeah. A therapist is a paid friend.
Right.
Yeah.
So I would listen, and I would dispense advice, and she'd feel incredible, and she'd feel incredible for about 2 or 3 days,
Right.
and then it would go back,
Right.
and then we'd repeat the cycle week after week after. We went on for quite a while, week after week.
Right.
She'd feel great, and she'd feel bad again.
Right.
And then, remembering my own work, I decided, without telling her, that I was going to change it up. And I called her up and said, I need help. I said, I appreciate that, we get together every week. You know me better than anybody else in my life. I too need coaching, and I'd like to talk to somebody about what's going on in my life. Can we at least alternate, where I get to tell you stuff? And so the first time we got together after I made that request, and it was a genuine request. It wasn't an experiment. It was a genuine request. I talked about me for an hour and a half. Already an improvement. That's a joke. We talked about me, and she dispensed advice.
Uh-huh.
And the next week, we did me again.
Yeah.
And she dispensed advice. And the next week, we talked about me again, and she dispensed. And in pretty short order, she started to feel amazing.
Yeah.
And everything turned around, and she was able to maintain her baseline happiness went way higher, even though the struggles she was having were still there. Her grasp that she felt like she could take control. And then I realized what had happened, and I called her up and said, do you realize that you got happier when you were helping me, not when I was helping you?
Right.
And I think, people who've gone through, Alcoholics Anonymous, the first 11 steps, for anybody who's gone through AA, the first step is admitting you have a problem. Most of us know that one. And what AA knows is that if you master the first 11 steps, but not the 12th, you're probably going to succumb to the disease.
Right.
Where if you master the 12th step, you're more likely to overcome it. And the 12th step is to help another alcoholic at service. And so I just want to know, in this self-obsessed, self-help, me before we, overly selfish, how can I be happy?
Right.
Where does how can I help somebody else be happy fit in?
Right.
Because isn't the true meaning of happiness the opportunity to help someone else?
Yeah, that's great. It's an incredible point, and one that our grandmother taught us, and we all kind of know and that we often forget. So at my university, we have a thing called self-care. We take self-care days, right? Because people feel crummy, and there's a lot of depression, there's a lot of loneliness, and it's increasing. And it's been increasing for years. So we have more self-care days. And it wasn't working. So they put in radical self-care. Radical self-care, right? Now, if Simon were the president of Harvard University, he would have other care days. Why? Because that's the secret, isn't it? I mean, you all know that if you want love, give love. If you want happiness, share ideas of happiness. So here's how I learned that, actually, in the context of actually teaching this to Harvard Business School students. I thought at the very beginning that I could impart this incredible knowledge, the science, 20% neuroscience, 50% social psychology, ancient philosophy, the Buddhist masters, all of it, into this brew that would turn the key in the lock. And I would teach them, and they would be like, this is unbelievable. This stuff is great, so interesting, and they feel better. But then they didn't feel better because they would snap back. They had this muscle memory.
Well, it goes back to that diet analogy.
Exactly right. Exactly right. Okay. So then I thought, well, what I really need to, and what's going on with that, by the way, is we understand the neuroscience of snapping back. What happens with your emotions, for example, is I can change your emotions by giving you a stimulus, a new stimulus. That's affecting you because you have a part of your brain, the limbic system of your brain, exists as an onboard computer to translate outside stimuli into emotions that are appropriate to your life. That's great. The problem is those things are happening to you. As long as happiness is happening to you, as long as your emotions are happening to you, you can't manage them. And if you can't manage them, you're not going to keep it. Now, sometimes that's great because if you're angry or sad or disgusted or fearful, that's not going to last either if those are happening to you. That's called homeostasis, the fact that it doesn't last. So I thought to myself, how can I make it last? Well, what I needed to do, the trick, is to take those ideas, those happiness ideas, from happening to them and moving them from the limbic system of their brain to the prefrontal cortex of the brain, the big meaty lobe sitting behind the forehead. Why? Because those are that's the executive center of the brain. And then when they really have the knowledge, then they can manage those things. That's the difference between pleasure and enjoyment, by the way. Pleasure happens to you. Enjoyment is something you can manage and remember and share with others. But it still didn't last long enough. I needed one more step. And that last step was I needed them to become the teachers. Then it really got and I remember because my father, who was He died young, but he was an incredibly dedicated and talented math professor. And I remember watching him lecture one time when I was a kid. And he was using no notes. He would go the whole semester lecturing on, advanced calculus with no notes. It's unbelievable. How do you do that? He said, well, I didn't really understand calculus till I taught it 50 times. Why? Because it was holographically imprinted in all different parts of his brain. I thought to myself, so how am I going to do that? And here's how I do it now. I explain the science, we discuss it, we have applications and exercises in their life, and then for final credit, you know what the final exam for my students is? They have to take my PowerPoint slides for the semester, take my name off, put their name on, and teach it to students who didn't get into the class because there weren't places in the class. That's how they get their final credit for the class. And only now, 6 and 12 and 18 months later, am I getting emails from the students saying, it really worked.
Yeah.
And that's your point.
Yeah,
I think.
So I think the thing. So what I'm learning from this discussion is that service is the thing that's missing, and I think purpose has become, though it's acceptable to talk about it publicly. Like, does that company have purpose, which wasn't the case a bunch of years ago. Purpose it's good that it's in the popular discussion, but I think an easier way to understand purpose is service. And service to a person or service to a cause, service, somebody who decides to be a stay-at-home parent and be of service to the family, legit, but to be of service to others. And I think where it becomes dangerous is that there's a difference between being in service and being a martyr. And the people who are constantly doing things for other people to the point where they make themselves unhappy because they've made themselves martyrs. There was a young leader I met who read my books, read your books, and it was like she was a student of leadership. She wanted to be a great leader. She had a couple of direct reports. She was this young leader, and she would send them home early every day, or on time, I guess, because she wanted them to have a good life, and she was a good leader. And then she would stay at work every night till 11 o'clock at night finishing the work because she didn't want to burden them. And what ended up happening was their work quality declined.
Right.
Because she did the work for them.
Right.
She took away the joy of work, the joy of accomplishment.
Right.
And she made herself absolutely miserable. She had mistaken service with martyrdom. By doing everything for everybody is not service.
Right.
Putting them an opportunity to try and fail and then be there for them when they fail to help them try again is service.
And let's wrap it back around one more time. One of the greatest gifts you can give to somebody else is accepting their generosity, which is incredible. I mean, this is basically the greatest gift you gave to your friend was accepting her generosity and helping you. And one of the things that I find from the people who are least generous is they give all day, but they won't take anything in return.
Yeah.
They won't accept anything in return
selfish.
because that's very selfish.
Yeah.
That's an incredibly selfish thing to do. Now, this gets back to a concept that you've written about and that I've written about too, which is that love and the ideas of happiness, this requires a circulatory system. You must accept love and you must give love, and you must do so constantly because it will coagulate. And if it becomes rigid, if it coagulates in your life, you won't be able to enjoy it. It will become unhealthy. I mean, the circulatory metaphor is actually appropriate in this case. So you got to ask yourself, do I not have enough love in my life? Well, the answer to that is, are you accepting and giving it enough? It's all about the flow, not about the stock. People answer the wrong question. It's like, I have? It's not a question if you have enough love. The question is if you have enough deal flow of love in your life. Are you? I'm an economist. Sorry. And you need more deal flow is the bottom line and how this comes about. Now, that's one barrier, but I want to ask you about another barrier to this.
That's good.
What would you say? It's the interesting thing. If you go back to the teachings of Lao Tzu or St. John the Apostle, perfect love drives out fear. And what we actually find as cognitive opposites is that fear and love occupy opposite parts of the human brain and are both psychological and philosophically antagonistic to one another. What I find interestingly is when my students come to me, or when my friends or anybody comes to me and says, I'm lonely. I don't know how to find love in my life. I always look for what they're afraid of. There's fear that's the barrier to their love. And when they say I'm really afraid, I'm afraid of everything, I usually find they don't have enough love in their life. Love of the divine, love of others, romantic love, love from friends, love from family, whatever it happens to be. This is the analgesic for the fear that actually grips us. So tell me, do you agree with that? That fear and love truly are cognitive, meaningful opposites and one treats the other?
No. No. I think there is a relationship between them. And as I think it through, at least the analogy, at least the example that I'm thinking of in my head, the greatest love is sometimes motivated by fear. Mm. So let me elaborate. Mm-hmm. So we'll go back to the military. You and I both have met people who have done things out of extraordinary courage. And we both know that courage is not the absence of fear. It's being afraid and being willing to do it anyway. And when you ask them, why did you do it? You thought you were going to die. You weren't ordered to do this. No one would have faulted you if you didn't do it. You have a family. Why did you do this? You almost always say the same thing or something very similar, which is they would have done it for me. Mm. And it's love. You ask a Marine, what's the secret of the Marine Corps? They'll tell you love. Mm. Love of a country, love of Corps, love of your fellow Marine. Mm-hmm. And it's weird for people to hear warriors talk about love, but they are motivated by love. If you, and I'm getting to my point where I disagree, as I'm making a very good case of why I agree.
So far, I'm liking every word here. So
if you talk to Dia Khan, Dia Khan, who those of you who don't know, her work is extremely important. She's a BAFTA and Emmy winning documentarian. She's done multiple documentaries. One of the ones she did is called White Right Meeting the Enemy. Dia is a Muslim woman living in the UK, and she said something on television that went viral, and as a result, she was trolled by white supremacists. It got so aggressive that the police advised her to stay away from open windows. The way she responded was to move to the United States and get to meet white supremacists. And she gave them a safe space to feel heard. Now, when a lot of us hear that, we sort of repel, that why do they deserve a safe space to feel heard? Right. But that's what Dia did. She wanted to understand. And by understanding, to understand, she had to listen. Right. And what happened over the course of time is they started to trust her and view her as a friend, and they could no longer reconcile their racist views with the fact that they're supposed to hate her, but they now care about her, and one by one they started dropping out of the movement. So what I've learned from Dia is whether they're white supremacists, whether they're jihadis, or whatever it is, every single one of them, none of them is motivated by hate. They're all motivated by
fear.
Love. Oh. Love. I'm getting to the point soon. First, I'll make your case, then I'll smash it down. So they're all
listens.
They're all motivated. They're all motivated by love, not hate. And just as an aside, because it popped into my head, did any of you ever see the movie *Inglourious Basterds*?
Yeah.
Okay, so Christoph Waltz plays this chilling role of the Nazi, right? And there was a great interview with him on Letterman when the movie came out, and he was doing sort of the promo tour. And Letterman says to him, you play this Nazi so effectively. What did you have to do as an actor to channel that kind of evil? And Waltz looks at him and goes, what? He wasn't evil. And Letterman doesn't understand. He asks the question again, but what did you have to do to play evil incarnate so effectively? And Christoph Waltz goes, what? They don't understand, because the reason Waltz played that character so effectively is he didn't play what we think a Nazi is, which is evil. Mm. He played it what a Nazi thinks a Nazi is, which is on the side of good. Yeah. That's what made it so chilling. Yeah. Right? Because nobody thinks they're evil. Everybody thinks they're on the side of good. Everybody.
Right. There's a famous Monty Python sketch where there's two Nazis talking to each other confidentially and say, did it ever occur to you that we might be the baddies?
So here's the fear part. Here's the argument that undoes that for me as well. Right? You talk to the people who operate the most out of love. Right. the most extremely courageous, the most extremely the great team players, they are more afraid. There's the fear. They are more afraid of letting down the one they love than doing the thing they're supposed to be afraid of. That makes me scared. Letting you down makes me more scared. Right? And if you think about true love or letting down your family, letting down your kids, letting down your spouse, I am more afraid of disappointing you than I am of failing. And I think it is the fear of hurting the person we love that drives us to overcome the things that we are actually afraid of.
Tell me this.
I guess that's actually a case for love.
It is a case for love. It is a case for love.
But what it's doing is it's creating confusion. Gray. There we are again.
Yeah,
it's creating confusion between the relationship between fear and love.
What you've done is the
not
way I've set it up
bifurcated
is too Manichaean between fear and love.
Whatever that means.
Manichaean, black and white, dualistic.
Okay.
It's not the dark and the light. It's not that one is the absence of the other. You think that they can actually coexist in this.
I think not only can they coexist, I think they're inextricably linked.
Yeah. The first time that you and I did that we talked, we were actually sharing the stage at I think it was the first time when we were both at a joint retreat of the Republican House and Senate.
We met. That's the first time we met
in Philadelphia. Remember that?
I do.
And we both had to get out because the Secret Service is all over the place because President Trump was. And
he was just elected.
He was just elected, and he was about to show up.
Correct.
And it was a really hot. And there's just protesters all over the place. There's the beginning. Yeah. And it was and we were having a great time.
Well, we have to, for the record, both Arthur and I preach bipartisanship, and so if we preach bipartisanship, we don't. Well, I mean, I guess you did because you chose AEI, but I'll talk for myself then. If I preach bipartisanship, I cannot publicly choose a side.
Right.
Who I vote for is my business.
Right.
But publicly, I will talk to. I won't work with politicians. But I will work with parties,
right?
Because I preach the same thing to
both. Look, I agree
To
completely.
work together. And I know you feel the same. And I know you feel the same way.
And part of the reason is because we need a competition of ideas,
right?
And at that, by the way,
and so we showed up. Trump was just elected. They had a big joint senator, the Senate and Congress came together, and the House of Representatives came together for a big offsite. And there was 4 speakers at the event. You and me were day 1. Mm-hmm. Pence and Trump were day 2.
Right. So you and I were Trump and Pence on the first day. Right. Yeah.
And we came in with our agenda, which is you guys work together, figure this out. And so I just wanted to set the scene as to why we said yes to this event.
Yeah. And we said yes to this because
and that's where we met.
That's where we met, and we were both giving talks about how and one of the questions that I asked rhetorically to the audience that day was, who wants to live in a one-party state? No hands. Well, how many people in the audience, I asked, are grateful that we live in a multi-party, at least a 2-party democracy? Every hand went up. I said, you just told me you're grateful for the Democrats. That's what you just told me. Because if you're grateful to live, and that's because the competition of ideas is fundamental to a free society. Now, here's the problem, Simon. We're doing our best, and things got worse. So how do we take these ideas of fear and love that you articulated really well, not in a Manichaean sense where they can't coexist,
which
but
means
in point
black
of fact,
and white.
Which means black and white. Yeah, that's right. That's a new thing. It's like I did his podcast, and he said that after I did the podcast, they had to create a glossary because I'm so pretentious.
No, well, it's no, it's because you're smarter than me.
No, it's just
And it was a joke when we logged off. It was like we recorded it, and I said to my producer, I'm like, can you go look up half those words for me, please? And then we thought, well, if I have to look them up, why don't we make a glossary for everybody else? So if you go listen to the episode, you'll actually see there's a glossary of terms.
Yeah, it's like translating it into actual, how humans talk. So
Manichaean,
and with the fear, with the goal of love, and with the overarching fear and the problems that we have in our society that we saw there, and we were trying to make better in 2017.
Yeah,
and it's gotten worse.
Yep.
What can we do? What can we do? What can each one? By the way, when I don't mean what can America do in this grand sense. What can each one of us do?
Okay. Well, I think we have to start big and then bring it down. So I'm going to stick with this Manichaean idea.
Okay.
That it's not just a black and white world, but that they need each other. To your point. They need each other.
Right.
And so I think one of the things that challenged America was when the Soviet Union went bankrupt, when they fell out of the game. The existential threat, the opposite to me, went away.
Right.
And so there was no, to your point about Republicans and Democrats, there was no balancing of anything.
The CIA literally couldn't recruit good clandestine service officers anymore.
I mean, a lot of things started to fall apart.
Right.
There was no, I mean, if you go back to Kennedy or Reagan, so I don't care what your politics are, if you go back to Kennedy or Reagan and listen to their inaugural speeches, both of them talked about peace on earth. They literally used the word peace on earth. World peace was the motivation, right? Now, if you hear somebody in national office talk about peace on earth, it actually sounds a little cheesy, right? And we cannot pursue peace on earth unless there's an existential threat to that peace. And so for years, I've struggled with the idea that I don't think we can ever get back on track and find our ideology until we have an existential threat. And as much as I don't want it, my idealist self doesn't want it, I think you have to have it.
But why?
God needs the devil.
But we had one. And it was called the coronavirus or something. And we didn't get closer, and we didn't have more love, and there was no peace on earth.
So the coronavirus, I mean, we can go down that rabbit hole, but
it became political. Like
it became political,
else.
but I think the coronavirus is not a true test of our ideologies, right? Which is the Soviet Union. We could all agree, even if we had different politics, that was worse,
right?
And so even though we would fight like cats and dogs, we could come together when that threatened us. And the coronavirus could have been that, but it's temporary. You know, we knew eventually it would go away. Whether it was a month, a year, or a decade, it would eventually go away, or we'd all die, I guess. And for years I've been uncomfortable with the idea, and I've come to the conclusion that the only thing that brings us together again is the rise of another existential threat. And it's been incredible to watch what's been going on in Ukraine, because for the first time in decades, our nation seems to be coming together in some respects.
Right.
Republicans and Democrats are actually working together in some respects. Like, you look at the polls about, do we consider Russia or Putin a threat, and the numbers are extraordinarily, we agree.
Right.
And what I think is good about that is when we focus on ideology that you and I would call purpose, all the other stuff becomes plumbing. When you remove the ideology, when you remove the purpose, and you remove the thing that reminds you of your ideology and your purpose, all we do is fight about nuts and bolts.
Right.
It becomes very finite. And since 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, we've had this steady increase where all we do is fight about details because there is no grand purpose anymore. And I think a common enemy, an existential threat, gives us back that ideology. And I think America is becoming more ideological. And you see it. We see it. We see it. We see NATO coming together. Like, Putin got it wrong. Right? NATO, he thought it would fracture us. It's making us come together. And if you remember, back in the Cold War days, Cold War 1.0, all of our alliances were based on ideology. If you were a communist, we weren't friends with you. And when the Soviet Union went away, so did that sense of ideology, and all of a sudden our alliances became economic. Right? Like, we think what you do is abhorrent, but we do business together, we can make this work. Right? And all of a sudden it became confusing as to who should and shouldn't be friends. And even Europe fractured, literally. And we weren't sure, France and Australia are fighting, over submarines. And I think the rise of a great enemy, and I'm very uncomfortable with this idea, is necessary.
Here's another strategy.
You don't have the love without the fear.
I get it. But here's another strategy, and I've done this actually with experiments, trying to bring people together from ideological poles. Now, to begin with, here's the good news. 93% of Americans hate how divided we become as a country. 93%. Let's just say, let's round it off to 100% of you. The problem is that 7% don't hate how divided we become as a country. And a lot of them are politicians. Many of them are in the media. A lot of them are on social media. And when you hate, if you think that the biggest threat to this country, which I believe is an incredible lie, is somebody who doesn't vote like you in this country, somebody's making money. When you hate, somebody's profiting, and it's not you. This is really important to keep in mind, that we are being conscripted as soldiers into somebody else's culture war, which is a really important thing to keep in mind. So how do you neutralize that? And I've done this a little bit with experiments of really, really red Trump voters and really, really blue Sanders voters. How do you get them to in a room to be able to talk about politics and not hate each other? Here's how you do it, turns out. You start the conversation asking them to tell each other about their kids. Yeah. That's how you do it. Why? Because you've actually moved the conversation into a part of the brain where they have shared loves and where they're exactly the same. And if they both have teenagers, then it's like common enemy and it's perfect, right? and so this is the key, because I mean, I've suffered a lot. So thank God for the U.S. Marine Corps. That's all I can say, This is important because once you've actually shown each other shared love, you cannot pay attention to the plumbing anymore. The plumbing of the ideological differences, it's just too hard to do.
So do you want to hear something really depressing?
Uh-huh. No, yes.
So you know the work of William Ury.
Uh-huh.
Bill Ury wrote Getting to Yes.
Yes.
Which is
famous book
and considered one of the most important negotiation books in the world. And Bill is a peace negotiator. That's what he does. He travels around the world and negotiates peace deals in all of the famous, conflicts around the world that we all know of. And Bill was one of the negotiators at the Camp David negotiations. This was the one where Yasser Arafat was offered like 90-something% of what he was asking for and couldn't make the deal. Right? And Bill was there. And I had the opportunity to ask him, how do these negotiations happen? Like, do you start with why? Does one side come in and say, why are you here? Well, we want peace. No, I know that, but you're putting a lot of political capital in, like, why are you here? What's it all for? Do you start with, all we want is for our kids to go to school, our people to go to work, provide for themselves, get an education, and both feel safe going to and from those places and coming back home at the end of the day. That's basically all we want.
Right.
And the other side going, well, that's all we want too. Okay, let's figure out how to do that. Mm-hmm. They don't do that. They start with, here's our list of demands.
Right.
And the other side's with, here's our list of demands, and then they negotiate.
Right.
Which is the worst way to do it.
Way to do it.
They do not start
doing what we talked about.
Doing what they at the highest levels of negotiation, they do not start with common purpose.
Because they start with the differences. And this is the key. Now, interestingly, 1 in 6 Americans is not talking to a family member because of politics today.
So 1 in 6?
1 in 6. 1 in 6. Which is catastrophically stupid, by the way. I mean, I can imagine having an estrangement with a family member because of abuse, but because of ideology, that's idiotic, and yet it happens all the time. Look, the ties that bind that don't break, family, this is one of the great, there's only really 4 habits to be a happy person. Faith, family, friends, and work that serves others. That's it, right? And you define what actually goes into what these categories, but this is what you need. And if you're indexing to 0 on family because your Aunt Marge is a Republican, that's just crazy. I mean, I remember that, in my own, I remember I was experimenting with different kinds of ideologies, and thinking differently than my parents. I come from Seattle. My mother's an artist. My father's a college professor. They're long dead now. From Seattle, the most progressive city in America. So you can imagine what my family's politics were, right? And I remember when I was cooking with my mother in the kitchen, as I was 27 or 28 years old at Christmas time, and my mother was getting really silent and really weird. And I said, "What's on your mind, Mom?" She says, "Your dad and I are really worried about you." And I said, "What is it?" She said, "I want you to be completely honest with me. Have you been voting for Republicans?" No. Look, this is weirdly driving families apart because they're focusing on this difference as opposed to the similarity of the matters of the heart. Well, and so, Yasser, now let's get back to Israel and Palestine. Run the negotiations, Simon. How do you start the negotiation?
I would not. I'd spend the first day not talking about the negotiation at all.
What would you talk about?
First of all, I would want them to talk about. One of the things I would want them to do. So here's how, okay. If you really ask me how I run the show,
right?
So first we'd go on a hike. Because
Yasser Arafat on a hike.
no. We'd go on a hike because and Bill Urey talks about this.
Yeah.
Which is walking next to somebody is incredibly disarming, and sitting across the table from somebody is adversarial, but walking next to somebody.
It's neurobiologically actually significant.
So I would start with a hike.
Yes.
And then we'd have dinner.
Yeah.
And I would make everybody sit next to somebody not from their side, and there would be an instruction that. I would assign them who they have to talk to, which is the person not from their side. And at the end of the dinner, they have to introduce each other, and I don't want to know anything that's in their bio, anything they've accomplished in their career.
Yeah.
And they have to talk to the person to learn about who they are as a human being, and then introduce them to the rest of the room as a human being.
And this is all before you start talking about territory and disarmament.
It hasn't happened.
So, okay. Agreed, because this, in the experiments
I want them to
works.
See each other as human with I just want them to.
You want them to see similarity of love. Okay, so now let's get it back to what each of us can do, because this is the practical portion of the program. We started by talking about the science of happiness and love, and now we want to bring happiness and love to each one of our lives.
And we have to switch to questions in a bit.
Yeah, and in a country that's really, really fractured. And we haven't actually talked about. By the way, my book is about how to get happier as you get older. Anyway, back to the subject at hand. So, Thanksgiving dinner. And Aunt Marge is loaded for bear, right, to talk about politics. What do you do? What do each one of us do? What do we do? I mean, this is the family relationships, the friend relationships, the fracturing that's actually going on in our neighborhoods and our.
Okay.
So let's do this. What did each one of that? What's your assignment?
Okay. All right. So, I think we have learned a lesson in the past few years that we do not know how to have difficult conversations, and we're not teaching people how to have difficult conversations. I don't care if they learned it at university or at work. I don't care, but we don't learn it. And that became abundantly clear, obviously, at the Thanksgiving table after elections, but it became very, very stark when it was apolitical and after the murder of George Floyd, where there was a significantly, an uncomfortably high number of leaders who, after George Floyd was murdered, did nothing. And they had no conversation with their team about it. Not because they're bad people. It's because they were so afraid of saying the wrong thing or of inflaming the situation or accidentally offending someone that they chose to do nothing. And I think we don't know how to have difficult conversations, a difficult conversation starts like this. I need to have a difficult conversation with you. I'm afraid to have this conversation. I'm afraid that I'm going to say the wrong thing that will inflame the situation or accidentally offend you. But I think having this conversation is more important than the fear that I have to have it. And I want you to know that it's going to be imperfect, and I need you to work with me as we stumble through it.
And by the way, I don't mean to offend you if I inadvertently do.
Correct.
And I want you to know that I love you before we even start.
Correct. And I say. And I think that the most important part of this, which is part two, which is we also don't know how to listen, right? We wait for our turn to speak, which is not the same as listening,
that's called a debate at Harvard.
Yeah. And when so I'll give you a real life example that captures this. So I have a friend who lives in rural Tennessee, and as we got to know each other, we discovered that our politics are very divergent, and she also believes in a lot of conspiracy theories, and we were walking. We went out one day. She was telling me something that she believed in, and I definitely thought it, and I fear I may have said it. How can you be so stupid, right? And she stopped, and she said, "You just called me stupid. You just called somebody you say is your friend stupid." And I realized what I had done, which was horrible, right? And I didn't double down. I retreated and apologized and realized what I had done is I didn't know how to listen. But I had judged, but I hadn't listened. And it set us both on this path because she thinks I'm stupid, you know? I mean, I think she's actually a better person than I am. I don't think she ever thought that. But the point is we disagree with each other. And we've had to learn how to listen to each other. And the way we listen to each other is we ask questions because I want to understand where it comes from and I want to understand meaning. And in every single time, if I ask enough questions, I will find something that is actually correct or I agree with.
Are you happier?
And I can affirm what she's talking
Right.
about, or she can affirm. And then what happens is the other person becomes much more open to listen.
Right.
And I love her to death.
Right.
And it is proof that two people who can have divergent,
Right.
I mean, completely divergent beliefs in how the world works. And by the way, she has convinced me of some things, and I have convinced her of some things.
So this is a key point. This is a key point. It's not just a question of empathetic listening. That's way overplayed. Empathy. You know what real compassion is? It's being persuadable.
I cared more about my friendship with her than being right.
And well, this is key because, the most important, and I've heard you talk about this in your work on being a persuasive communicator, is the most important part about being persuasive is also being persuadable. And that requires a lot of listening and a lot of humility.
And all I found is that if the politics of if the politics at the Thanksgiving table, instead of trying to be right and prove them wrong, which is what we do,
Right.
and both sides are guilty.
Right.
Both sides have self-righteousness to an unbelievable level.
Right.
To try and find common ground, that if you dig and dig and dig, pick any subject, blah, 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 NATO's taking it. Well, it's true a little bit. America does pay its debts where the Europeans didn't always pay their debts. There's an element of truth in all of it. And if you can affirm and find that truth and you can build you actually find that you go like this and then you go together.
Yeah.
And I don't think we teach it. And it's a learnable, practicable skill, which is what's so upsetting to me.
Yeah. And this is also, by the way, the secret to having a happy marriage. And if it truly.
Well,
truly.
to fight I think you taught me this, didn't you? That you have to fight to get to resolution.
Uh-huh. Yeah, and that's especially true if you're married to a Spaniard like I am.
In the spirit of listening, let's take a few questions. As you can see, we'll go in any direction. So
Great. So I will bring a microphone to anyone who has a question. We will agree that questions start with a W or an H, sometimes a D, and they're generally short. So who would like to try that?
That's funny.
That's funny. It's like we used to say at the American Enterprise Institute, please put your protest in the form of a statement, in the form of a question. That's right, yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. Great talk. Arthur, very briefly, you mentioned that to find a meaning or to have a meaning, you had to be unhappy.
Yeah.
I think some version of that.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, one of the things that you find is that there are lots and lots of experiences that we have that are pleasant to give us purpose. But almost nobody can understand their life's meaning and purpose unless they understand their own limits and their own resiliency. In other words, what they were actually able to live through. So when you ask somebody, tell me about a time in your life where you really learned who you are as a person. They never say that week at the beach at Ibiza with my friends. That's not what they say. Now, that might have been meaningful to you. That might have been a meaningful experience to you, being with your family. But when you really understood the direction of your life, who you could actually be, because this is really what it's all about. Who can I be? That's what sets my compass. Because I want to be the best person that I can possibly be. We're driven to excellence as people. And you only understand the nature of your own excellence when you're challenged. And challenges, it's rough. And you know what I'm talking about. A challenge is not like, let's see if I can run 5 miles today instead of 4 miles today. No, we're talking about I got a bad diagnosis from the doctor. I lost somebody that I love. The person I was in love with broke up with me. My company went bankrupt, or I thought it was going to. I was afraid. I was sad. I was angry. And here's how I dealt with it. That's the reason that we actually need that. And if we go through this psychological hedonism of simply trying to avoid suffering day after day after day after day, we actually we'll be compassless. We'll be directionless. And the direction per se is the essence of understanding our own life's purpose.
And that's true for teams as well, by the way.
Yeah.
Which is, in leadership, it's the exact same test. Which is you can't judge the quality of a crew by how a ship performs in calm waters. You can only judge the quality of a ship by how a crew performs in rough waters.
Yeah.
And I meet so many companies that are like, we have a great culture. I'm like, times are good. Let's wait and see.
Exactly right. No, exactly right. And how you judge leaders ultimately is under those exactly under those circumstances. And once an organization goes through a crisis, and by that I mean a community or a family or a country, then you'll actually see what the ultimate potential was, and whether or not it's actually even worth keeping together.
Agreed.
Yeah. And it's funny, actually, those of you who are married, like I am, you know that you don't actually understand the durability and the direction and the strength and even the beauty of your marriage until something really bad happens, until something really scary happens.
This goes back to the thing of there's no right or wrong, good or bad, which is, good comes at a cost, and bad, sometimes, tragedy in a family brings you much closer together.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it certainly has been the case in my marriage, my family. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. It's been such a great talk. I really enjoyed it and learned a lot. Thank you. Simon, as far as I'm concerned, you should take over the Middle East negotiations because I think it's really needed. Yeah. So my question is, I totally agree with much of what you're saying. I wondered to what degree facts and truth matter in all these discussions, because it seems like, of course, we're trying to meet people and trying to get on the same page as people, but sometimes there's certain issues that come up, and I don't know how relative it all is. So,
the mistake that the left makes, and it's a repeating mistake, by the way, is that. Well, I think James Carville said it best, right? The difference between Republicans and Democrats is Republicans want to win and Democrats want to be right. And the part of the brain that controls behavior and emotion does not control rational thought, the limbic brain versus the neocortex. And you can't change someone's emotion and how they feel about something with facts and figures. It just doesn't exist. And it's sometimes we even well-intentioned. Let's take politics out of it, like really well-intentioned stuff. Let's take, and you can do both sides of the political spectrum, by the way, right? So if you want to take the Vietnam War, McNamara getting on TV, telling how many North Vietnamese we killed today and how many battles we won, didn't convince anybody that we were winning. The facts we were winning factually. We actually did win most of the major battles, and we did decimate the enemy, right? True. But it was emotional. And if you want to look at the climate change debate, where you have scientists trying to convince us to believe in something by telling us things that we cannot factually say will happen exactly. It might be 30 years, might be 50 years, we're not exactly sure, but here's the data. But these are emotional messages, and we don't make them emotional. And so, do facts matter? At some point, of course, they matter. But in terms of inspiring or scaring people, they don't.
Let me give you an example of this.
Is that true?
Yeah, and a real life example. How I learned this the hard way. This is how I learned this the hard way category. I'm a big believer that the free enterprise system is the greatest anti-poverty measure in human history. And the reason is because I got the data. I'm an economist, and 2 billion of my sisters and brothers have been pulled out of starvation-level poverty because of globalization, free trade, property rights, the rule of law, and the culture of entrepreneurship. It is just the greatest thing. And I was making this case at dinner in my house, and somebody I love and somebody close to me said that, yeah, but I read in the paper about this little girl who lives with her mother in a car. What is your capitalism doing for her? And I lost the argument because I was talking about 2 billion people, and she was talking about a little girl who lived with her mother in the car. And what am I supposed to say? Well, that little girl, she should have started a small business. I wasn't prepared because all I had was facts and figures in point of fact. That's what I had under the circumstances. You actually need to make the human case, and you need to have the humility to understand that you don't have all the facts.
Yep.
I don't have all the facts.
Right.
And people who disagree with me strongly, they do know things that I don't know about their lives. And we have to have the intellectual humility, the lack of hubris, and the desire to actually connect with other people enough not to die on every hill.
Yeah.
Because we'll just lose. And then we can't take the world forward, and we can't connect more with people. And ultimately, what we're talking about here tonight is more love, more happiness, more connection. I mean, again, if there's a punchline of the things that we're talking about here, we're gathered here together to talk about the happiness. Happiness is love, full stop. And if our knowledge is getting in the way of that, well, woe be unto us.
You have to lead with the emotion, and the facts support the emotion, not the other way around.
Right. I learned that from you.
2 more questions.
That's the why, by the way.
Yeah.
Fellas, appreciate the mind meld. We've talked about the psychology of happiness, like on an individual level. I'm curious, when you study from a sociological perspective happiness as a concept, and if there are societies that we can learn from that are just happier by definition, and then back into individual reasons on why those societies might be happier than other societies.
Yeah. The really interesting thing about studying happiness is, number one, there's a lot of effort to use the data to find which are the happiest societies, and they're exercises in futility. And the reason is because people in different places with different cultures, with different languages, define happiness in a very different way. The United Nations every year puts together the World Happiness Index, and it's all nonsense and it's a waste of time. And they should know better, because, you know, if I basically said, which country has the best music in the world? I got an idea. I'm going to go to 150 countries, and I'm going to poll 1,000 people in each country about how much they like their local music, and I'm going to average it up, and then I'm going to say which has the best music on the basis of this. That's what the UN Happiness Index is all about. What you always find, the Northern European social democracies are the happiest countries. Denmark, where my ancestors are from. Denmark, that's the happiest country. Well, you know, in Denmark, I've actually studied happiness in Denmark, and they're like, they have a word that really defines the essence of happiness as hygge. H-Y-G-G-E.
I'm pretty sure I built that from IKEA.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, that's right. You put it together yourself. It's cheap. Yeah. Anyway, hygge, and what it means is like this sense of contentment and coziness, and it makes me feel like I want to go out of my mind. I don't want that. I don't want hygge. I want adventure. I want this. This is what I want. I want this. I don't want a comfy couch and coziness. Well, that's actually why my grandparents came from Denmark to this country. And the point is, you have the right, and this is the essence, by the way, of what Thomas Jefferson was talking about in the Declaration of Independence. So everybody thinks Thomas Jefferson is an incredible writer. He was not. He was a great copier. He copied the Declaration of Independence. He cribbed it from George Mason's of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which talked about the unalienable right of all men to life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. And he said, no. I'm going to change one word. Pursuit of happiness. And he was asked later, why'd you do that? And he said, I was taking dictation from the American mind. Beautiful, isn't it? But okay, so what's that all about? What that basically says is that what's this country? This is a few gentry and a lot of riffraff, and we're going to do this weird thing where in this country you get to define your happiness and you get to pursue it. I'm not going to guarantee it. You may not get it, but you get to define it and you get to pursue it. Now, this is an incredible thing, because what this suggests to us is that you can't compare where they were from and where they are, because they're mutants. This is a mutant culture. Some of you, by the way, how many of you are immigrants to the United States? How many of you are immigrants? I want to say thank you for choosing America, and I hope you stay. Because we need you. We need you for our own pursuit of happiness. And that's why this is an impossible question to answer. I wish we could. I can compare Americans over time, right? Because the same group of people. I can compare the same person over the course of their lives, but I can't compare the Danes and the Americans. I can't compare them.
I think there's a nuance. I agree, and I think there's a nuance, which is it's wherever you feel like you belong. Yeah. Right? And this, you know, if you feel like you're a black sheep in France and you don't feel like you belong and you emigrate and you come to the United States and like, this is my place. Right. I've always been a little bit weird and different and more, you know, aggressive about it. I don't want to take 6 months of vacation. I want to work and never take vacation. You know?
I don't want to retire at 49
that's
or
why
whatever they do in France.
That's why I moved to America. Yeah. But and so I think you're unhappy when you don't belong, and you find happiness when you do belong, which is why we change cities, which is why we change neighborhoods, and sometimes why we change countries, because this culture is not where I find happiness. Right. And so I think you're right that the stupidity is to compare, because it's a relative. What's the definition of your marshmallow? Right. But the reality is, it's not the society. It's where I go that I feel like I belong.
Yeah, and there's even another wrinkle on that. When you ask Americans about that, you know what they all have in common? They all love that they're all misfits.
Yeah.
So that's what we all have in common is that we're misfits.
Right.
And that's the weirdest thing of all, which is why we need continuous flow of misfits. More immigrants, please.
Yeah.
Our last question.
How you doing? I don't know if it's a question or a statement. I did 21 years in the United States Army, right? Senior non-commissioned officer, 2 combat tours in Iraq.
Right on.
And when I retired, I thought that I was supposed to go through a depression, all these things, unhappiness. But I think it was more of a choice in going through that door to be unhappy, to take medication, depression, all these things. But then to me, I think happiness is a choice in a way. I don't know if that makes sense because I started doing things for myself. I created my own business. I started doing things. I started doing inspirational speaking. But to me, I think it's a choice, something to go after. Does that make sense?
I mean, yes. I mean, I think it reinforces a lot of what we've been talking about tonight. You know, narrative matters. You know, the thing that I hear from vets, regardless of how many years they serve, is the one thing they miss more than anything else that they struggle to repeat, no matter how good their life is, you know, however you want to define that after service, is the brotherhood and the sisterhood. And you have your own business, and I still bet you miss the brothers and sisters in arms. I mean, for one of the most obvious things is you call them brothers and sisters. Like in business, we have colleagues and coworkers. Like you had brothers and sisters, and I remember the first time someone in uniform called me brother. I remember that was real, and so I don't think it's. I'll go back. I don't think it's good, bad, right, or wrong. I think, you know, you have a narrative. You brought something else. You brought all the skills to bear, but you still miss stuff.
And people suffer at different levels in different ways. And this is the multiplicity of experiences. It's really important for us to recognize that we need to love each other more because many people suffer in different ways. When my son came home from his first deployment, he was getting constant texts from the guys that he had been with for the last 8 months who couldn't get along with their families. They didn't understand their families. And one of his men, he's a squad leader, he's a corporal, so he's a non-commissioned officer, and one of his guys OD'd and died at Christmas time, right after his deployment. And why? I don't know. He didn't want to be there. He didn't want to be in here is what it came down to. And so different people cope in different ways and different people struggle in different ways. And the one thing that we all need is to give and get love. And that's the one thing that we're all actually capable of.
But there's data on this, right? There's very, very few combat suicides.
Right.
They don't.
Right.
There's very few deaths by suicides in combat.
And there is a high level afterward.
And it's because you have,
Right.
and you know this, it's because you have love that keeps you alive, and you have somebody who's got your back, who's got your six, and you don't even like each other, but you'll give your lives for each other, which is a strange concept to people outside of the service, right? And then when you lose that support network, that intense, nobody understands the love that you have for your fellow soldier when you're being shot at. And then when you lose that intensity of love, it's I have nothing to live for. And we know that a lot of suicides happen not from the deployed, but the ones who don't get deployed.
Right.
The guy who's left back to drive the bus.
Right.
You know, because they missed out on that. And so it goes right back to the full circle, which is, I think, the most important thing that any of us can ever do to find happiness for ourselves is to learn how to love somebody with more sacrifice and more giving than we can possibly bear.
Right.
And I you know, I've made this, you know, you've heard me say this before, which is we have an entire section in the bookshop called self-help, and we have no section in the bookshop called help others. And what we're missing is a help others industry.
Thank you.
Thank you.